A month after I died, my wife resurrected me. But this is her tale, not mine. It's about the price she had to pay to return me to the land of the living. The date is December 8th, 2022. And 1 month ago, I died. There was a car collision. I remember it. It is, perhaps, the most vivid memory of my entire life. There's almost nothing on this earth quite as horrifying as remembering your own death. Almost. When I woke on December 1st, I remembered nothing from November. I ceased to exist. And then I existed again. I don't recall an afterlife. That, in itself, was enough to break my mind. Maybe souls exist. Maybe not. I only know that it took a tremendous psychological toll to suddenly find my soul, or whatever you might call my essence, back in its mortal body. In addition, my physical form had not decomposed. My wife's virtuous voice was the first thing I heard. "Robert?" I eased open my eyes to see her kneeling beside our bed, clutching my hand in hers. "Emily?" I croaked. "Good morning, my love," she sobbed. "How?" I whispered. That was all I could muster. What else was there to say? I don't think Emily had expected me to remember my death, but she quickly composed herself. "It wasn't your time," she feebly responded. "I saved you." "Emily, I died. I remember dying," I said. "No, Emily fumbled for a lie. "You were hanging by a thread and—" "You're lying, Emily," I interjected. "I stopped existing. There was nothing. I know I died. I felt it. And something tells me that a lot of time has passed. So how am I alive?" My wife's lip quivered, and she averted my gaze. I stared at her, awaiting an answer. I'm not sure how long we spent in that state of silence. "What is today's date?" I asked. Emily finally looked at me, face covered in tears. "December the 1st, she whispered. "December the 1st? I asked, incredulously. I don't... That doesn't... How can that be? A whole month? What did you do, Emily?" She wiped away her tears, leaning forwards and resting her chilly face on my bare chest. "I found a way to undo what happened," Emily finally replied. My wife wouldn't tell me more than that. She left me to, as she put it, wrap my head around things. I spent hours facing the wall, contemplating what Emily might have done. But I'm not an imaginative man. I couldn't possibly have conceived the horrors that had unfolded in order to bring me back. When I eventually made my way downstairs, after showering and getting dressed, my wife was sitting on the sofa. She smiled and pointed at a pizza box on the coffee table. It was from my favourite takeaway. "Robbie," Emily said, trying to stifle tears, "I know you're scared. I'm scared. I just need you to understand. After you died, I couldn't do it. I couldn't see a way forwards without you. So I found a way forwards with you." I wanted to say something, but my heart melted at the sight of my beautiful wife, the pizza box on the table, and our favourite film waiting to be played on the TV screen. I had come to terms with the concept of death, but I was intoxicated once more by the allure of life and love. Even though I hadn't existed for the past month, I had missed Emily. I had missed life. I decided that I didn't need to know how I had returned. That first night was perfect. I didn't even notice the small details that would later concern me. The next day, as I was eating breakfast, the adrenaline finally dissipated. What about my parents? Your parents? Our friends? I asked Emily. I can't hide in here forever. How will we explain this to them? I haven't figured that out yet, my wife sheepishly admitted. And that was when I first noticed it. The slight whiteness of my wife's skin. She'd attempted to conceal her ghostly colour beneath makeup, but she was no mortician. Beyond the outline of her face, which was coated in heavy layers of foundation, her complexion had faded. She looked like a corpse. "Are you unwell?" I asked. "You should eat something." "I'm fine," Emily assured me. "I haven't seen you eat anything since yesterday," I said. "What's wrong with you?" "I'm fine, Robbie," Emily reiterated. "I'm used to not eating. Grief will do that to you." I wasn't entirely convinced, but it seemed like a reasonable explanation. I felt guilty. My wife had spent a month carrying the burden of losing me. Meanwhile, I had the luxury of simply vanishing from existence. But she was just shaming me into dropping the topic. I know that now. And I realised it hadn't been a figment of my imagination when I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of a car starting. I peered out of the window and saw Emily drive away. She didn't return for an hour, and I pretended to be asleep when she crawled into bed. It seemed a better idea to discuss things when we'd woken up. "Where did you go?" I asked. Yet again, Emily was not eating breakfast, and she looked even paler than the night before. "We needed milk," my wife replied. "At 2 a.m?" I scoffed. "From the petrol station," she explained. "It's a 24-hour shop." "The milk could have waited," I replied. Emily was lying. There was absolutely no doubt about that. I was already struggling to come to grips with the philosophical implications of my own resurrection. That was only compounded by my fear about what Emily might have done to herself. Suspecting that my wife might repeat her early morning road trip, I had the idea to plant my iPad on her back seat and track it from my phone. A smidge after midnight, I heard Emily close the front door. I watched from the bedroom window as she clambered into her lime green Ford Focus, and I hurriedly tiptoed downstairs. I waited until the sound of her engine had faded into the distance. Confident in the clear coast, I darted to my Volkswagen, frantically fumbled for my keys, and opened the door. My behind was barely on the driver's seat, but I'd already fired up the engine, and I started to track my wife at a safe distance. She didn't travel far. In fact, when Emily drove into the centre of the city, I thought, for a painful second, that my wife might have been telling the truth. I felt like a terrible husband for doubting her. But Emily did not park at the petrol station. She was not buying milk. My app showed the iPad's location. It was near a nightclub. My wife hates nightclubs. She hates staying up past 9 p.m. Even if we were to ignore the fact that I died and came back to life, which is already the most baffling situation one could imagine, this still would have been a suspicious situation. Nevertheless, my mind did not for a moment leap to the possibility that my wife could be having an affair. She had proven her love by, well, resurrecting me. I parked a few streets away from her and travelled on foot, heading towards the marker that displayed my iPad's location. I found Emily's Ford Focus in a deserted car park, but I couldn't see her. So, I hid in the bushes and waited in the dark. The light and sound of the city had been comforting, but that empty car park, basking in the blinding glare of a solitary lamppost, was eerily silent. There was something unnatural about the place. It was shrouded in a thick mist. Emily eventually emerged from a back alley with a young, handsome man. She found him at the nightclub. I was nauseated. He leaned towards my wife, but she shoved him back, and was on the precipice of bursting from the bush and revealing my location. But something petrifying happened. My wife changed. Her pupils vanished, and her eyes turned black. With vice-like strength, Emily clutched either side of the man's horrified face and squeezed. I don't know how to describe what I saw, but I will try. It has plagued my dreams for the past week. The high-pitched scream that emanated from the man's mouth was the most haunting sound I have ever heard. His arms and legs flailed helplessly as his body began to decompose. His flesh shrank and shriveled, hugging his skeleton more tightly with every passing moment. It was as if I had seen the young man age a lifetime in mere seconds. Emily released what was left of his face, and her eyes rapidly returned to normal, though her flesh was just as pale. The worst thing is that her victim, for some reason I do not fully understand, had not yet perished. He lay on the cold tarmac of the car park, futilely gasping for air with his wheezy, deflated lungs. His fragile skin was barely able to adequately stretch across his bones. I believe I even saw the outline of his heart beating beneath his shirt. That macabre image seems to be permanently etched onto my eyeballs. The man's face was a nightmarish apparition. It was no more than a skull coated in papery flesh. His eyes were glazed over. If they were the window to his soul, then his soul had most certainly been absorbed by my wife. His arms and legs were broken and twisted in ways that I can only imagine must have been agonizing. After an elongated dying gasp, the man's incessant writhing ceased. With unnatural ease, my wife carried his corpse to her vehicle, dumped the crumpled mess into the trunk, and quickly drove away. I didn't immediately go home. Whatever my wife did to resurrect me, it charged a heavy toll. Returning to my Volkswagen, I sat in the dark and conducted online research, but I couldn't find anything on the subject of resurrection. Nothing legitimate, I mean. Certainly nothing about consuming souls in exchange for saving mine. That was what I'd witnessed. I was sure of it. After a few icy days of living in my car and ignoring my wife's calls, I found myself overcome with guilt. Emily made a desperate decision, and it came with an unimaginable price. I started browsing the internet to find some sort of explanation for what happened to her. A particular forum recommended a gothic bookstore not too far from the city centre. They had a library section with various books detailing the history of the occult. They had things you couldn't find on the internet. I drove straight there and waited for the store to open at 9 AM. A little old lady appeared in the main shop area, and she seemed shocked to see a customer waiting at the door, bright and early. Her shop was a well-kept secret. Her name was Greta. She was genial and gentle, unlike the sinister shopkeeper I'd pictured. I didn't tell her about Emily, but I asked, generally, about a creature that could do the things my wife had been doing. Greta's eyes widened, and the bookstore darkened. She asked me how I'd come to know of such a power. I dodged the question and said that I was simply curious. She nodded and beckoned for me to follow her to a bookshelf. She picked up a dusty, leather-bound book that was entitled Veil Breaking. "Do you know somebody who has broken the veil?" Greta asked, her eyes swimming with terrified tears. "I don't believe in all of that. It's just a story," I replied. "Thank you for helping me. How much will that cost?" Greta looked at me with sorrowful, pitying eyes. She pushed the book into my arms and patted it. Her gaze suddenly fell to the floor. "No charge. I fear you have already paid a heavy price," she whispered. I left the bookstore, returning to my freezing car, and proceeded to flip through the pages of the nightmarish history book. I'll explain what my wife did. The book claims, firstly, that every human has a soul. Now, I didn't used to be spiritual. After I returned from the dead and witnessed my wife's twisted transformation, however, I found myself unable to deny the existence of a spiritual realm. All souls exist on the other side of a thin veil, according to the book. Veil breaking is the process of recovering said souls and returning them to the physical world. That comes with a price. And there is the process whereby the deceased individual's body must be restored to perfection. That also comes with a price. The being that extracts the price is called Deet. Many different people have depicted him in many ways. In the book, there was only one drawing of the entity. It had a bony, brittle, vaguely human figure, much like that of its victims. And it also had horrible black eyes. The eyes I had seen on Emily's face in the car park. There were bodies at its feet. Decaying people were lying in a messy mound, and they were taking their final breaths, much like the man I saw several nights ago. There was also this passage. "It is believed that Deet can break the veil and restore any lost soul. In return, the entity demands the body of the invoker as a vessel. The vessel must feed on the life essence of others. If it does not, it perishes." I stopped reading at that point, feeling a deeply rooted piercing pain in my gut. My wife had forged the deal with some unholy thing, torturing herself just to bring me back. I couldn't wrap my head around that horrifying revelation. Foolishly, before I'd even read more of the book, I raced home. I was desperate to rectify my wrong. Emily needed me, and I'd been selfish to forget that. I slammed the accelerator to the floor and zigzagged my way along the spider's web of roads back to our humble abode. In the early morning light, our snow-covered house glistened. Everything was so still, so calm. I gently pulled alongside the Ford Focus, and as I stepped out of the vehicle, my feet crunched in slushy snow. It was the only sound on our silent road. When I reached the front door, I dug around in my pockets for my keys, collecting lint beneath my fingernails, before noticing that it was unlocked and ever so slightly ajar. I timidly pushed the door open. "Emily?" I called out. Our household was drowning in darkness. I realized every curtain had been drawn. I expected to not see or hear a thing, but there was a telling creak on an upstairs floorboard. Summoning my last ounce of courage, I braved the stairs. Each step groaned beneath my frightful feet, as I ascended towards the lightless void of our upstairs landing. There was the sudden sound of a door slamming. I inhaled deeply, creeping towards the bedroom, the source of the noise. I wrapped my trembling fingers around the door handle and paused. "Emily?" I hoarsely projected. "I'm going to open the door, okay? I love you. I'm sorry for not coming home. I just had to decompress." Not a peep from the other side. I opened the door. And then I saw something so horrifying that I immediately shut it again. But I'd seen enough during that fleeting moment. The scene within our bedroom was a real-life interpretation of the drawing from my veil-breaking book. My wife, with festering flesh that possessed a fully white hue, was standing on our bed, surrounded by a pile of 24 slender, depleted corpses. Well, not all of them were corpses. Some of them were still seizing on the bed and floor. One young woman looked at me with the same pupilless, whitewashed eyes as the first victim I'd seen in the car park. She raised one skeletal arm towards me. It was bending backwards at the elbow, and her hand hung limply at the wrist. Her flesh had worn so thin that it bore shredded incisions, through which the whiteness of her bones protruded. I saw all of that horror in the space of a second. When I slammed the door shut, Emily unleashed an inhuman wail. "Robert!" I heard her wheeze. I held the door closed, too frightened to remove my fingers from the handle. I heard the bed springs release, followed by weighty footsteps treading across bones. Then a foreboding thud on the door. "You're home," she whispered. "Emily, I love you so much, but I need to figure out how to stop this horror," I said. I released the door handle, sprinted down the stairs, and darted out of the front door. I locked my car from the inside and sat very still, staring at the open door to my blackened house. Nobody emerged. I immediately got to work. I broadened my occult expertise. After an entire day of reading, I finished the veil-breaking book. I was fairly certain I'd found a solution to Emily's awful affliction, but I needed Greta's help to interpret what I'd read. In actuality, I simply drove back to the little old lady's shop because I didn't know where else to turn. My friends and family didn't know I'd returned to life after all, but I was afraid that one of our loved ones might check on Emily at some point. What if my wife were to hurt them? I had to believe that she wouldn't. I had to believe, most importantly, that she could be saved from Deet. "I was wondering when you'd return," Greta sighed as I strolled through the door of her dingy store. The place was empty. Nevertheless, the elderly woman felt it necessary to lock the door, display the close sign, and usher me into the back of the store. She had cozy living quarters tucked away. That hardly surprised me. It seemed a fitting stereotype. A lonesome keeper of gothic books, living in a forgotten store. In terms of her personality, however, Greta broke the mould. I would have pegged the sweet lady as a horticulturalist, not a guru of the dark arts. She was neither cold nor menacing. She was overflowing with compassion, and it was compassion that I did not deserve. "I abandoned her," I confessed. "Tell me what happened," Greta replied, consoling me. As we sat in her lounge, comforted by the heat of the log fire, I explained everything to her. The lady sat and listened attentively until the very end. She did not utter a word. When I finished recounting my blood-curdling tale, Greta simply offered a meek nod of her head. "When you first came to my store and spoke of what you'd seen," she said, "I knew it could not be you. Your aura is too pure. You're in the land of the living. Your wife is not." "But I shouldn't be in the land of the living, should I?" I asked, lip quivering as I attempted to retain my cool disposition. Greta shook her head. "No." "I read something in the book that I think could bring Emily back," I said. "Something about returning my soul to the void beyond the veil. I need to die, don't I?" Greta nodded. "But dying isn't enough, is it?" I asked. "I have to give my soul directly to Deet." Greta shuddered, and a darkness enveloped the room. "Please," Greta pleaded, "do not speak its name." "Sorry," I replied, "but am I right?" Greta solemnly nodded. "I am sorry, child. Yes, it is the only way to restore things. I fear that it might be too late for your wife, however." "What do you mean?" I weakly whispered. "Well, how many souls has she consumed?" Greta asked. I shrugged. The old lady simply nodded. "You said Emily spoke your name when you went to the house this morning," Greta trailed off thoughtfully. "There might be hope for her." "What do I need to do?" I asked. Greta did not answer. She rose to her feet and strolled over to an old black and white framed photograph on the mantel above her fireplace. She stretched out a withered ancient hand and gingerly stroked the picture of a large happy family. "That little girl is me," Greta said, tapping the frame. "My family has a long history with the occult. My parents and I were simply intrigued by the history of the supernatural. But some of my earlier ancestors used to practice horrendous things. My grandfather told us a story of his great-great-aunt Jane. That was when I first learned of veil breaking. The story, passed from generation to generation, is that Jane had invoked Deet to save her brother. She slaughtered an entire town of people to satiate the malevolent entity, and Deet fully claimed her body. Was there anything that could defeat it? I asked. Time. It exhausted Jane's mortal body many years later. She died, but Deet caused untold suffering during that period, and she is only one of many who have fallen for Deet's lie. However, your wife's story does not need to end that way. There is a way to put things right before Deet seizes control of her body. We can stop the senseless killing. We can return your soul to the void and whatever lies beyond. Why wouldn't it work for me to simply kill myself? I asked. I would have to show you other books in order for you to fully understand the way in which our souls are attached to different planes of existence, Greta explained. I don't remember any type of existence after death. I shrugged. She smiled. You don't remember it because you weren't in a place that could be remembered. Trust me when I say that we must return you to the void. If you were to die through natural means, your soul would cease to exist. Existential dread flooded my mind. Given my preoccupation with saving my wife, I hadn't stopped to think about what might happen to my eternal soul. Yet again, I found myself trying to conceive the horrifying reality of simply not existing. It is imperative that we do this properly, Greta instructed, grabbing her coat from a hook. I beg your pardon? I asked, What are you doing? We're going to your house, the sweet lady explained. We will confront Emily together, and we will beg her to claim your soul. It is the only way to return you to the void and ensure you enter the afterlife. And most importantly, it is the only way to release Emily from Dietz. I didn't argue with the woman. I knew I had to save my wife. And that brings us to the present moment. I am hurriedly recording this message whilst Greta drives. I want this to serve as a parting message, I suppose. I hope we save Emily. I hope, if she does survive, that Greta leaves her this message. Emily, you are the most wonderful person I have ever known. When we were together, it was as if we were the only two people in the entire world. What a cliché. But it's true, and that's why you went to terrible lengths to bring me back. I love you with every fibre of my being. My heart breaks at the thought of leaving you. But you're not Emily anymore. I have to bring you back, as you did for me. My time is up. I shouldn't be here. And deep down, you know that. I love you, and I will be waiting for you. Always yours, even after death parts us. Robert. My name is Greta Black, and I am finishing Robert's story on his behalf. When we arrived at the house, I took the young man's phone and slipped it into my coat pocket. Robert had a calm, steely disposition. He looked nothing like the frightened little lamb that had first walked into my store. I could see it in his eyes. He was determined to save his wife. That was the only thing which meant anything. He had come to peace with the prospect of death. "Emily!" he shouted, charging through the still open front door of his house. The sun had already set, so he was stumbling around in complete darkness. I patted the wall, searching for a light switch, but Robert had already begun to ascend the stairs. "Emily!" he continued to shout. "Wait," I pleaded, struggling to keep up with the young lad. I'm not sure why I risked my life by taking him to the house. I still felt guilt for what my ancestor Jane had done to the poor people of that town nearly 2 centuries ago. I had to right her wrong, but I also wanted to save Emily. Nobody managed to save Jane. By the time I made it to the pitch-black landing, Robert had already reached the bedroom. Light from the room spilled across the carpet of the landing. He had his back to me, and he was blocking the doorway. "Emily!" Robert bellowed, as I shuffled towards the room. "You have to take my soul!" "No!" his wife screeched. When she spoke, it sounded as if 2 voices were warring for her vocal cords. I realised that time was not on our side. "Please, darling," Robert implored. "This isn't any kind of life. How can you be with me if your own soul dies?" Emily screamed so loudly that the windows in the bedroom shattered. I tried to squeeze past Robert, but he held out an arm to obstruct me. I saw the devastation that Emily had caused. A room of corpses, a graveyard of bones, a mountain of death. Atop the pile, which covered the bed and most of the floor, stood Emily. Her skin had started to tighten around her skeleton, much like the skin of her victims. Her faintly beating heart was visible beneath her shirt. Take my soul, so we can both be together, Robert explained. It might be many years from now, after you've lived a long life, but this doesn't have to be the end for us. If you refuse to take my soul, we both cease to exist. Deet isn't a gift giver, it's a taker. Please, make things right. Robert started to walk towards his wife. She froze in place, snarling at him. He lifted himself onto the bed. Just take my face in your hands, sweetie, Robert begged, inching towards the monster that used to be the love of his life. Go, she growled, backing away from him. I could, but you would never be with me again, he said, calmly reaching for her hands. This is the only way to save both of us. I believed it to be too late, but somehow, in a wondrous and haunting twist of fate, I was wrong. I witnessed what I would describe as simultaneously the most beautiful and terrifying display of humanity. Wailing into the night, Emily grabbed Robert's face with her two gnarly, near-fleshless hands. I could not see Robert's reaction, as his back was turned to me, but I could hear his victorious sobs of triumph. I love you, he whispered. The brave man unleashed a strained, torturous yelp as his wife drained his body of its essence, slowly returning him to the void. His body crumpled. His limbs snapped and splintered into haunting shapes, but his pain was, fortunately, over in a matter of seconds. His limp body collapsed onto the bed. I eyed Emily. She did not meet my gaze. She was looking at the carcass of her husband, who lay atop a pile of massacred people. As I peeled my lips apart to utter some words of consolation, Robert's wife unleashed an ear-shattering wail. But then I felt the room's temperature drop far below freezing. A mist filled the room, encompassing the pained woman. It cleared to reveal Emily. The real Emily. The colour had returned to her face. Her eyes were a brilliant shade of blue, and her flesh was full of life, but she was distraught. I helped her down from the bed and led her from the room. What I did next was morally questionable, but I did not want the poor fractured woman to spend the rest of her life rotting in a prison cell for something that a demonic entity had done. I used my knowledge of certain occult practices, shall we say, to remove the evidence of what she'd done in that house. I know it was wrong to do so. I can't bring back the people that have been killed, but I hope I have released the souls of Deet's victims safely into the void. I don't know what kind of afterlife waits beyond the veil, but they're free. At long last, my family has been redeemed.